Hi, we're here with Norton Spiel, father to David, Saul, Michael, and Jonathan Spiel, grandfather to David's children, Sarah and Melanie, Saul's children, Shira, Ari, and Sivan, Michael's children, Lauren and Jamie, and Jonathan's daughter, Scarlett. Also great-grandfather to Leon, Shira, and Harry Bogosian's child. So, Dad, when were you born?
I was born on March 21st, 1934.
And what do you remember your first memory?
No, not really, but
What's your oldest memory?
my oldest memory is what my mother, is not a memory of mine, but what my mother told me about my birth. When I was brought in to see my mother, she shrieked and said, "No, that's not my son," because I had hair on my shoulders, hair on my back, and she thought I looked like a monkey. So, but after a few days, the hair fell off.
So you were born like Esau.
Sort of.
So what's your first memory?
My first memory is when we lived on Clinton Street, right off of Delancey, between Broome and Delancey. There was an old woman in the building who used to buy a loaf of bread, a widow. She used to buy a loaf of rye bread, but she couldn't eat the crust. And I loved the crust of breads. My mother used to bring me there every day to chew on a rye bread crust.
And how long did you live there?
Probably about 2 years. And then we moved to 173 Henry Street, which is on the corner of Henry and Jefferson, across the street from the Educational Alliance.
And how long did you live there?
Until I was about 16 years old. Then my family moved to Queens. My father bought a house in Kew Garden Hills, and we moved there.
All right, and tell me about what you remember, say, before you were 5. You would sit down to dinner. What would you normally have?
Next to nothing, because I was a lousy eater. My mother, I was a child and still in the high chair, and my father would make all kinds of funny things in front of me, and I'd stare up to the ceiling. He'd say, "Look at the bird flying here." And I'd look up and my mouth would open up and my mother would pop food into my mouth. That was about the only way that she could feed me.
Okay, so but like when you were like in between 5 and 10, what did your mother serve you for dinner? Was it chicken? Was it fish? Was it...
It was a little of everything, some salad and fish and chicken and steak.
And did you go shopping with her for food?
No, I did not.
She never took you along?
No.
Do you remember push carts? Do you remember horses in the streets?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So tell us what happened when you first went to school.
Well, my father, I didn't have too many friends. I only had one friend in the building that we lived in. And I used to go out and play with the other kids, but they didn't understand me because I didn't speak English. I only spoke Yiddish, which my parents spoke around the house, and that's the only language I knew. When they didn't want me to understand something, they'd speak in Polish, because that's where they came from. And I went down to play with the kids, and
What did they call you?
I don't remember what they called me, but
Didn't they call you the little foreign kid?
yes, they did, actually. I remember that now. But I was born in Beth Israel Hospital on First Avenue, and I wasn't a foreign kid. I was an American-born kid.
No less.
But I started to learn English a little bit, but I remember coming home one day and I told my mother, "You're a basket." And my mother said, "Basket? What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, that's what the kids were saying." And I said, what is, you know, so finally I found out that what they were trying to say was, you're a bastard. And my mother had a good laugh about that. So
Okay, how old were you then,
uh,
roughly?
probably about 5 or 6 years old.
And what school were you in?
Well, at age 5, I was totally literate in Yiddish. I could read fluently, and I could speak fluently. And I remember when one of my parents' friends came over to the house. It was a man who was a friend of both my parents, and he asked me, "Who's in the house?" I said, "2 people." He says, "Who are they?" I said, "Me and my father." "Oh yeah, and my mother was there too." She didn't count as a people because I thought people were just men.
Huh. So was he talking to you in Yiddish?
Yes, of course.
So how did he say that in Yiddish? How many mensch?
No, wie viel Menschen, wer ist du in Stib? Who's here in the house? And I said, 2 Menschen.
So translate mention.
Menschen means people.
Oh, okay. And how old were you then, roughly?
I was probably around 4 years old.
So did you go to kindergarten?
No.
Okay, so first grade was your first grade?
Yes, it was.
What school was that?
I was in a school called RJJ, which is Rabbi Jacob Joseph. It was a yeshiva just a few doors down from my house on the same block.
And they accepted you speaking only Yiddish?
No, actually, the principal, he was there with a bunch of other teachers. Told my father that I was too young. I should come back next year with him when I'd be 6 years old. And my father whipped out a Yiddish newspaper and laid it on the desk. And he told me to read it. And I read it fluently, all the Yiddish. And the teachers they were gaped. They couldn't believe that I was able to read Yiddish so fluently and so well.
So even though you weren't fluent in English, they accepted you?
Yes. Okay. And the teachers, one of them, they grabbed me and hugged me and kissed me, and they thought I was maybe the new Vilna Gaon of, which, the Gaon from Vilna was a brilliant Talmudist and scholar. And, I actually turned out to be a lot less than that.
And in first grade, did they start teaching you English?
Yeah, I started learning English. I had Hebrew in the morning, and then after lunch, we had English studies with teachers who taught only English.
And math, I assume.
And math, arithmetic, and so on and so forth, yes.
Okay, and so at 5 you started in first grade. How long did you stay in RJJ?
Well, I was there a number of years till age 11, but I remember one incident that made me cry was the fact that my mother had taken me to the movies on a Saturday to the Lower East Canal, which is a movie theater in the neighborhood. And somebody in my class saw me coming out of the movie theater on Saturday, it was Shabbos, and they told the teacher. So the teacher stood me up in front of the whole class. Everybody circled around me, all the other students, and they all pointed at me saying, "Goy, goy, goy," which means non-Jew, non-Jew, non-Jew. And I started to cry. I remember that very vividly.
Do you have any other stories from RJJ?
Oh, quite a few.
Okay, so let's start with what you remember from the youngest.
Okay, in my first grade, there was nothing very interesting or very traumatic in any way. When I got into second grade, I had a teacher named Kalmanovich. He was a brutal man in many ways, but one of them was if somebody wasn't right, didn't answer a question right, or misbehaved in any way, he'd say, "Come over, come here, let's shake hands." And he would grab the child's hand and squeeze with all his might until the boy dropped to his knees and started kissing the Rebbe's shoes, saying, "Please, let me go, let me go."
Did you meet him later on in life?
Yeah, later on when I was I guess, 21 or 22, after I got married, my wife Sonia and I moved back to the Lower East Side. We couldn't afford anything fancier than the apartment we had. It was a one-bedroom, tiny apartment on Hester Street. Hester corner, well, it was Hester and Division Street and Suffolk Street. It was a triangular building, so there were three corners. Well, I was saying that we moved to that house on Hester Street and Division, and it was very close. It was only about 2 or 3 blocks away from the house I lived in earlier before I was married. One afternoon, I was went down to the subway on East Broadway, and lo and behold, who did I see on the platform? It was the same Rabbi Kalmanovich. So I walked up to him. I said, "Rabbi Kalmanovich, how are you?" And I shook hands with him. I grabbed him by the hand, and I started squeezing, and he tried to get away from me and pull his hand back, and I wouldn't let him, and I kept squeezing with all my might. It was my one revenge I had on the teacher. Finally, I let his hand go. I said, "Have a nice day, Rabbi," and I got on the train.
Okay. And continue on. I know you got a lot of stories.
Yeah, well, then we went to, my next teacher was Mr. Markov, who was also, he believed in hitting the child when he didn't know something or when he didn't behave. And at one time I was one and one time I was the other, but he had a thick ruler and he asked the boy to hold out his hand, and he slapped on the palm of your hand 2 or 3 good whacks, and you're left with a blistered hand, all reddened and blistered. And that wasn't very nice, very pleasant.
Were all these teachers basically Eastern Europeans?
Yeah, most of them were. They must have, it was just about the beginning of World War II, and there were a lot of refugees coming off the boats, and they had to get jobs. So if they knew anything about Judaism or about Talmud or prayers or Jewish, the Bible, they would be hired to give them a job. They knew nothing about teaching.
Well, they were all Orthodox?
Yes, they were all.
What about the ones who taught English and math? Were they all Orthodox?
No, they were not necessarily. They might have been, but it was not. Those were not classes and religious classes.
So they were considered Shagitzes, right?
No, they weren't. No, they weren't. They were Jewish.
They were conservative Jews?
I don't know what they were. I never asked. I didn't think to ask. But they were not there to teach religion. They were there to teach math and arithmetic spelling, writing, and so on and so forth.
Having taught the Satmar Chassids myself, when you made a plus sign when they made a plus sign on the board, were they allowed to, or did they turn up the bottom into a curly Q?
I don't remember that happening.
Okay. So what other teachers did you have run-ins with?
Well, the most traumatic teacher we had was a Mr. Podolsky. Maybe he was a rabbi, I have no idea, but he was an Orthodox man, and he taught Talmud and he taught other things like that. This rabbi, this man was a bit of he shuffled around the room. He could not walk very fast. He couldn't run. And the kids were very disruptive because they were not interested in what he was saying, and he was just not a good teacher. He didn't know how to activate the class into learning and knowing what was being taught. We, on the other hand, took advantage of the situation. This Podolsky had very thick glasses. He couldn't see very well, and he shuffled around the room. So it was no good. He couldn't chase after a kid because the kids could outrun him. But what we did was, in our anger at him, we took chalk and we put it on his seat. And when he sat down, he had a perfect target on his backside. And we all pulled out rubber bands and paper clips. And when he wasn't looking, we'd shoot him in the back with clips. If a kid was disruptive in any way or showed any kind of disinterest, he would throw a book at him. He'd pick up any book, whether it was a Siddur or a Chumash, and he'd fling it at him. 99% of the time he missed because everybody ducked. One particular instance I remember very well, there was a fellow who, in the back of the room, we had paint pictures framed in glass and of different things, and one of them was George Washington crossing the Delaware. And the student started yelling out to the teacher, "Hey, Rebbe, throw a book. I dare you, you fat slob." And the teacher threw a book. He ducked. The book hit a picture of George Washington crossing the Delaware, and it went crashing down to the floor. At other times, we did other things. There was a guy named Pinchas Buxen in the class, who later went on to become a state senator. He saw steam coming out of the pipe, out of the relief valve on the radiator, so he kicked it and knocked it off, and the entire room was full of steam. So, and there was water all over, a slight amount of water, but we all said, "Hey, Rebbe, I have to go to the bathroom." One after each other, we went to the bathroom with an empty container, filled it up with water, came back and spilled it on the floor. A lot of us did that. By the time recess rolled around, the teacher was sloshing in water. It wasn't very deep. It was only an inch thick, or maybe a half inch, but there was water all over the room.
Uh-huh. What about the guy with the carrots?
Oh yeah, there was a kid who came in middle of the semester, a new kid, and they seated him right in front of the teacher. He came packed with a bag full of vegetables to have for lunch, raw vegetables. So he took out a bunch of carrots, and he whipped it on, "Hey, Rebbe," and he flung it right in the teacher looked up and he flung it and hit him right in the face.
What happened to him?
He was ejected from the school the next day. They sent him home and they didn't want him back. But there were many other things that happened in that school. The most egregious thing that happened was one day we had to stay in a room during recess, which was between 11 and 11:30 or something like that, 11:15, because it was raining outside. So we stayed in the room. We decided to play hide and seek, and we all dispersed in different places. Some in the bathroom, some there was a big closet there where books were stored and coats were hung. It was a very high ceiling, about 12 feet high, I would think. And this one kid, Benjamin Sifri, said, "Hey, let's go into the closet rather, and we'll take some books and coats, and when the guy who's it is coming, we'll drop the books on him." So we all did that. We went into the closet. Sifri took along a whole briefcase full of books, and we climbed on top of the bookcases, and we waited for him to come in. The kid who was it, to come in. The bell rang, and we just stood there, way up in the air, and the teacher came looking for us. He opened the door and walked into the closet. So Sifri picked up the big bag of books, and he slammed it down on the teacher's head, knocked him out cold. He was lying in the closet on the floor. We got terrified because we thought we killed him, or that he killed him. So we just threw all the books down and the coats and whatever we had as ammunition. And it was finally a heap of coats and books. And we jumped down and we went back and sat quietly in our seats. We were terrified. We didn't know what to do, so we did nothing.
What teacher was that?
That was Fat Johnny Podolsky.
Oh, and
We call him Father John or Fat Johnny. So he finally, we saw the doors opening, and all of a sudden he walked out, and we looked at him in amazement that he survived. We didn't know that he was still alive. And
How did he torture you kids?
well, before that, I have to tell you something he said that was quite interesting. There's a chapter in, maybe it's in Isaiah, I'm not sure which of the prophets said this, but he said in Hebrew, Banim gidalti v'romamti v'hem pashubi, which means I've raised and nurtured children and they sinned against me, meaning us, for what we did to him.
This was in the aftermath of the books and the...
Oh yes, yes. And there were other things that happened. One kid, Abraham Trenk, he was so distraught from all this going on, he wanted to jump out of the fourth floor window we were on. He wanted to threatened to commit suicide. The window was open and he was up on the ledge, and we all ran up and we dragged him down, so to prevent him from doing that. Other kids, there was one young fella who was a very good artist. I think he was a Hungarian Jewish kid that came over, and he was in New York, and he escaped the Holocaust, no doubt. He was a good artist, and we published a newspaper. It was called The Adventures of Moshe the Ghost, and you could see drawings of Moshe the Ghost. He pictured doing different things in this concentration camp, which we had a school there and barbed wire fences all around it. That's how he drew it. And Moshe the Ghost would take a stick and pole vault over the wires to escape.
Wait, so it was a school behind the barbed wire?
Yeah, it was a school, and the school was RJJ. He tried to project that we were slaves in a concentration camp.
So what year? How old were you here?
I was still about maybe 6 years old or 7 years old.
Well, it had to be later than that.
No.
No?
No, it wasn't later than that.
Okay, 7 years old.
Yeah.
So this was 1941?
No, it was, I'm sorry, I'll take that back. I was 11 years old.
You were 11?
Yes, I was 11 years old when
and
that.
Was your last year at RJJ?
Yeah, what happened was I was so paralyzed with fear of getting hit by the teacher, getting a book thrown at me, for not knowing the answer, or for not misbehaving, which I really didn't do. I was the youngest kid in the class, and I was kind of almost paralyzed in my seat. I was afraid to move, and I couldn't move. I felt physically crippled. I think obviously nothing hurt me, but I was so traumatized that I just couldn't move. And they called the principal up, and they had to unscrew the desk from the floor, the chair, the seat, and they carried me home with it. And
in the chair? In
the chair. My house, fortunately, was only about 30, 40 feet away from the school. And they brought me up to my parents' apartment, and my mother was distraught, and she called a doctor. And the doctor came over and took a look at the situation. He saw and there was nothing physically wrong with me. I was just traumatized. So I was sent to Brooklyn Children's Hospital for observation. I was there one day, and I felt better, all completely healthy. So I jumped out of the bed, and I was helping the nurses with the really sick kids. I remember my Aunt Anna came to the hospital, and she brought me a box of comic books. I think they were the illustrated copies of some of the famous novels around.
Classic comics?
Classic comics, right. And then from then, I went into public school. And
wait, let's just jump back a second. So this convinced Bubba and Zeta to take you out of
matter of fact, the psychologist in the hospital suggested they do that because they said that don't send them back to that school, and they realized that they have to move me somewhere else because I was in danger of further further problems if I would
Now,
stay
did
there.
you complain about the school before then to your parents?
I did at times.
And they thought you were just exaggerating?
Yes.
Okay, so now let's just talk
Well,
about...
before that, let me just add one other thing. My father had me bring home a note from the teacher every single day if I was good, meaning not in the way I behaved, but good in knowing the answers that the teachers posed to us, or I behaved, normally and really took advantage of the teaching. If it was not, my father would hit me. As a matter of fact, he came up to class one day, and he walked up to me and he turned to the teacher and said, "Ask him a question about the work, about what he's supposed to be knowing and studying." And the teacher asked me, and I did not know the answer. And my father, in front of the entire class, slapped me in the face and turned around and walked out. So
Okay.
I had no love for my father at that point, certainly. And he used to hit me regularly, not for conduct, but for not knowing the questions he asked me regarding my studies. And I remember lying in bed at night, cursing him and wishing he were dead.
Wow, I never heard that before.
Yeah, it's true.
All right, now what did Zeta do for a living back then?
He was a house painter. He worked very hard.
He didn't have a car, did
No, well, later on he got a car. He got an old 1939 Oldsmobile in 1945
he?
or
So
46.
this is already after you moved to...
No.
You're still in Manhattan.
Still in Manhattan, still at the same apartment.
So how did he, work without a car?
He carried stuff, and I helped him carry it, buckets of paint and ladder. He'd put a ladder. He was a very strong man. He'd put a ladder on his shoulder, and he carried 2 5-gallon cans of paint, and I carried the brushes and other lighter stuff.
Well, you couldn't do that while you were at school.
No, but it was on weekends and on holidays or whatever.
And he just worked all by himself?
Yeah, he worked by himself. He had come to the U.S. He didn't know anything about house painting, but he got a job with somebody, learned quickly, and within 6 months or a year, he went into his own business, and he hired other people and taught them how to paint apartments.
And of course, your mother was a homemaker.
Yeah, she was a homemaker. I did go at certain times later on when I was a young teenager. I'd go to help him do some painting, sometimes on Saturday or Sunday. But what bothered me about my father also was that my grandparents lived right nearby, and my grandfather was a chassid. Well, my father sent me on Saturday on Shabbos, he sent me to the shtibel, and he went to work, and I thought that was very hypocritical of him.
Now, your grandfather, talk to us a little bit about him. So, when you were born, your grandfather was already living in Manhattan, correct?
Yes, a couple of blocks away, yes.
And what was your relationship like with him?
Not much, except he liked the idea that I was going to yeshiva. He was Orthodox, very Orthodox. And
Well, you said he was a chassid, right?
yeah, right. Yeah, he was, and he, most of the time in the shul, in the shtibel, I ran around with a friend of mine whose father also went there, and he was a guy named Bernard Rosenmore. His Hebrew name was Bunim, and we do all kinds of pranks and fooling around. And at the back end at the front of the shtibel, there was one guy who was the guardian of the food that they'd have after the davening. They'd have wine or whiskey, and they had herring, and they had cakes, and so on. So we would sneak under the table that he was sitting at and try to steal some of the sweets. And he, of course, would kick us and chase us out of there. It wasn't, I didn't do much learning of davening, but I picked up quite a bit of it. And it was just, for me, it was the entire episode was every Shabbos was horseplay, fooling around.
And was your grandmother alive?
Yeah, my grandmother was alive. She was a wonderful, wonderful woman.
What was her name?
Her name was Mindel, or Minnie.
And
If
your
you might.
grandfather's name was Dave.
David, right, Menachem David, but he was called David.
And your mother's grandparents were still in Poland.
My mother's mother died when she was 8 or 9 years old, and she had a stepmother who was anything but nice to her.
Huh. And she was the one who was still in Poland.
No, her mother died.
No, but the stepmother.
The stepmother was still in Poland, as well as her half sisters, and her mother died, and her father remarried. He was also a very Orthodox guy. He was a chassid, an Amshanov chassid, which is one of the branches of Hasidism, and all of them perished during World War. My grandfather in Poland died before the war, but all his children, my mother's sisters, and their progeny all died.
So none of your mother's relatives made it here?
Just one of them, a half-sister, well, she was one of the stepmother's children. She had lost her husband and her children, and she was in a concentration camp alone, without any family, and she escaped and was almost murdered by a Polish guy who tied her to the back of his wagon and had her chasing after him by her hair. He tied her to a wagon, and he drove, and finally she managed to free herself. And the guy kept driving the wagon, and he went over a lake that was ice. The ice cracked, and he and the horse fell into the water, and they all drowned. They both drowned, the horse and the Polish man. It was a good.
But your aunt was alive.
She was alive, right? And at the end of the war, near the end of the war, she was in Buchenwald, and she met another man who lost his wife and children, and they married.
But wait, step back a second. So the Polish guy captured her, technically, and then he died in the water with the horse. How did she get away?
Well, she had freed her hair from the back of the wagon where she was tied. He tied her with a rope, but she managed to pull her hair out of the knot, and she was free.
But then she was recaptured and
No, she was.
Buchenwald?
She must have been recaptured and sent to Buchenwald, or maybe it was close to the end of the war, and Buchenwald was a kind of after the war was a center for refugees. It was in Germany. All the other ones were in Poland, but the most of them were in Poland, and Russia and Ukraine. But the Germans were defeated, and they all went back. They all were forced back into Germany. And after the war, those who could make it to the Buchenwald were then sent to either they ended up coming.
So in other words, when she went to Buchenwald, it was already a refugee center.
Yes.
Probably.
Yes.
And what was her name?
Her name was Rachma.
Rachma.
Yeah.
Okay. I remember Rachma.
Yeah, and she was a nice lady. She had 2 kids. One of them was born in Germany. Herschel, his name is. He lives up in Vermont somewhere. And a younger sister, I think, might have been born in the U.S., or maybe not. Maybe she was.
Her name?
I don't remember her name at the moment.
All right, so now you're about 8 years old and you go to public school, right?
Yeah. Well, I went to public school, but before that, something extremely important. My father was insistent on my continuing a Jewish education, so he enrolled me in a school called the Hebrew National School, or the National Hebrew School, I should say. And that was also about a block or so away from my house. on East Broadway. I had the good fortune to have a teacher there, Mr. Golddiamond, who was the epitome of what a teacher should be in every sense of the word. He loved the children. He taught us beautifully. He read poetry to us. He read the prophets to us. He explained everything, and he used to always had a smile on his face. And there was a mixed class, boys and girls together. And on Shabbat, he invited us to come to his home. His wife was also a teacher in the school, but she made cookies and candies and drinks for us. And on Shabbat, we would stay in his house for an hour or two, have all these delicacies, and he'd read us poetry, Hebrew poetry. And I did not lose my hatred. I lost my hatred. I didn't really hate Hebrew. I just hated the way it was taught in RJJ. But I took to my learning a lot better. My father also insisted that I take a book out of the library in the Hebrew school, any book I wanted in Hebrew, read it, and then write a composition about it. So I got all kinds of interesting books that I read, and that's how my Hebrew improved immensely. And I'd write a composition, and he would correct it for me, whether it's grammatically or spelling-wise. And that was an indelible thing in my life that I appreciated so much. My father stopped hitting me when I was about 11 or 12. I never got hit anymore. After I left the yeshiva, and it was a much better relationship I had with him.
Okay, wait, so that's after you left RJJ, you mean?
Yeah, after I left RJJ.
And how long were you with the National Hebrew School?
I was there for about 3 or 4 years.
And why, till what age?
Till bar mitzvah age. No, and it had to be more than 3 or 4. Maybe it was 3 years I was there.
So you didn't go to public school?
No, I also went that was for 3 days a week.
Oh, that was Hebrew school.
Hebrew school it was Hebrew school after Talmud Torah, after.
Okay.
And I was there Sundays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays, or maybe 3 days or 4 days a week.
Okay, so.
And that was in the afternoons into the evening.
Okay.
In the earlier part of the day, I started out in 6th grade.
Okay, so
in
you
the
went from RJJ to public school. Was that like a culture shock?
Kind of, but I spoke English pretty well by then. And I went into the second half of 6th grade, which means it was probably sometime in between January and June. I was there for for those few months, and then I went to junior high school.
Okay, let me just stop for a second. So in public school, weren't the kids there a lot tougher?
No, they weren't tough. It was a mix, boys and girls together, and I never had any incidents in the school.
Okay. What percentage of those kids were Jewish?
Probably, I would say at least 50%.
Yeah, okay.
Because it was largely a Jewish neighborhood. And we also there were some Italian kids, some Hispanic kids, some...
Polish kids?
No Polish kids. It wasn't a Polish neighborhood. There was a couple of black kids there, and so on. And I got along well with all of them.
All right, so your grades, you did well in public school?
Yeah, in public school I did very well. And I went to PS 12 Corlier's Junior High School. It was another few blocks further away from my house. And I went into 9th grade. And that was another experience. I was there through the 12th grade when I ended up going to high school. But I had, it was a difficult, oh yes, before that, let me mention, when I was 10 years old, or 11, I started taking violin lessons. A friend of mine, Bernard Rosen, the same guy I fooled around with in my grandfather's shtibel, he started taking violin lessons, and he liked it. He said, "You ought to try it." So my parents went out and bought me a violin and hired a man to come in to teach me. And I studied violin. I'd practice a little bit during the week. I wanted to go out and play more than practice, but in either case, and later on, I went to the Third Street Music School, which was quite a serious music school. It was on the Lower East Side, and I got violin lessons there as well.
And when did you get your interest in chemistry?
Well, in chemistry, I got my interest when my Aunt Anna, who was a wonderful aunt, she used to buy me presents and sit on the floor with me when I was very young, and with blocks and all kinds of other toys, and she'd come up after work. She wasn't married yet at that time, and she would play with me. And when I hit age 11 or 12, she said, "Why don't you?" She brought a chemistry. She said, "What would you like?" So I said, "I'd like a chemistry set," because I learned a little bit about it in junior high school, and she bought that for me. And I did all kinds of little experiments. Later on, when I finally got to high school, I got into more serious things, but we'll talk about that later. Yeah, well, I remember a lot of things that my parents told me about their history, which is kind of interesting. They both came from northeastern Poland. My father from a city called Ostrów Maziowiecki, and my mother from a little village nearby. The name of the village was Brok. I think you spell it B-R-O-K. Brok nad Bugiem. It means it's on the Bug River. And they met at an early age, and they fell in love with each other. And my father had some interesting experiences where he left. He ran away because he didn't want to be conscripted into the Polish army, which usually was a 10 or 20-year commitment.
Was he married already?
No, he was still single. And he took off, he got some false papers, and he came to America, and they stopped him at Ellis Island, and they sent him back eventually, back to Germany. He got other papers, and he ended up going to Mexico, to Veracruz. He had a friend there that was living there, and he spent a little time there. And then at that time, my grandparents came with the whole family to the United States. So my father went and eventually was able to get into the U.S. because his father was already here.
That was after like 4 years, though, right?
Yeah, I don't know how many years it was. But in either case, at one point, my father went back. He was writing to my mother, and she was answering. And he went back, and he couldn't go to Poland because he didn't want to be arrested for having skipped the, not being in the army. And this is all prior to World War II, obviously. And he went to Danzig, which is called Gdansk today. It was an open city, a free city, and it was sort of sandwiched between Poland and Germany on the shore of the sea there. And they got married there, and I still have the notice in Yiddish of their marriage. They couldn't go to Poland, so everybody in the wedding party, from my mother and all the family, came to Gdansk, and they got married, and then they left there, went on the way to Paris to have a honeymoon, and they passed through Germany, and they saw the beginnings of Hitlerism. This is 1932. And that was the beginning of Hitlerism. And they saw the various troops training, police, and so on. They ended up in France, had a good time there, I guess, and proceeded to come to the U.S. My mother had been sent out to work when she was in Poland. She was learning how to make women's dresses because she didn't have any other skills. She worked at that, when she came here. She used to make her own dresses, my sister's dresses, and dresses for other people. She was quite skilled at it. Between the ages of 8 and 9, I learned about what was happening in Europe, in particular about the Holocaust. My father had invited various friends of his to come up, mostly writers for the Forwards and other intellectuals, to talk about what was going on. Actually, we lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on Henry Street in Manhattan, and until when my brother was born, I was 9 years old. So then I was moved into the living room for a place to sleep because we only had 2 bedrooms, and my sister Rhoda and I shared it until that time. And when my brother Mark was able to, at age 10, sleep in a separate bed apart from a crib in my parents' bedroom, I was shifted to the living room on a couch in a corner. And very often on Sunday mornings, I'd still be sleeping there, and my father had his friends in there talking about what was happening in Europe, and I was in a corner, and I overheard a lot of stuff that I didn't know about. At some point, my father also took me to hear lectures by various individuals who had managed to escape the Holocaust and were telling about it. And it was very dire and very sad. And my mother's whole family was still in Poland. And sometime in the near future, in 1944 perhaps, she got information that her entire family, meaning sisters and their husbands and children, were all murdered by the Nazis. She almost had a nervous breakdown, if not a complete nervous breakdown, because of it. I remember it very distinctly, and the doctor suggested she be sent to a place, a calm place, and where she could recoup. And that was in Lakewood, New Jersey. It was called the Rockefeller Estate, but basically it was a home for people who had emotional and mental problems. Eventually she came out of it when she realized that there's nothing she could do about it and life must go on. But I remember feeling such hatred for the Nazis. I used to dream about capturing a Nazi and me torturing him in my apartment, just keeping him alive, but just torturing him because I was so enraged at what they were doing. My father also at the same time took me to shows, dramatic shows on 2nd Avenue in various Yiddish theaters. I spoke Yiddish fluently, so it was very easy for me, but we saw all the great artists of that and great actors of that time, and that certainly gave me another memory to know about European Jewry. When I was 9 years old or 10 years old, I started traveling around Manhattan, and I heard I guess in 1948, I was 14 then already, but I heard that the Israeli theater company was coming to New York. Habima it was called, which means the stage. And I went to the theater. I didn't have any money really, but I was able to buy a ticket. At one time, there were 4 plays that I saw, and a couple of them I was given a ticket to by some person who was amazed to see a young kid of 10 years old wanting to go in to see a Yiddish show. So that to me was
Yiddish or Hebrew?
Yiddish. No, I'm sorry, it was Hebrew. It was a Hebrew show. My Hebrew was very good at that time. and I understood most of what I was seeing. Some of the things was over my head. It was meant for adults, but it was it made me very happy to be able to see this, and I was so proud of Israel being created. And that's when I guess I was 10 years old. No, I'm sorry, that was a little later. That was when I was 13 years old. No, 14. Sorry, once again, my arithmetic is not right today, but I was 14 years old when I did that, because it was after the state was created in 1948. In either case, that was a very, I guess, very...
Precocious?
No, it was a very inspiring period of my life. I'd like to talk a little bit about my liking classical music and how all that started. When I was 11 years old, I had a friend who lived about a block away from me. His name was Bernard Rosen. And he took up, at the suggestion of his older siblings, he decided to get violin lessons. When I heard about it, he suggested I do so too. So I talked to my parents, and they went out and bought a violin for me. And I took lessons with the same instructor that Bernard Rosen was getting. And playing that instrument, it got a little bit better and better every day. And eventually, after a couple of years, I ended up in the 3rd Street Music School, which was a well-known school, until about age 14 or so. But there were other things that were pressing, and that was girls. And I thought that was much more interesting than a violin. But what the violin left me was an intense love of classical music. At that time, there was a program on, I don't know if it was CBS or QXR, with the Longines Symphonette. It was a half-hour show, and Michel Piastro, I'll never forget that name, he was the conductor, and I listened to a lot of every night I would put that on. At that time, I was still at the Hebrew school that I had started after yeshiva. After my bar mitzvah, I was there until about age 14 when I graduated that school, and they had no further escalations of study. So I signed up for a school in the Upper West Side of Manhattan called Herzliya. It was a Hebrew school and Hebrew teachers seminary. I'll go into that at some length at a later time, but let me switch back right now to my public school time. At age 12, I entered. Age 12, I entered the PS12, which is called Corlier's Junior High School. It was about 7 or 8 blocks away from my house, and I was in a different world once again. I joined the band because I did play the violin, and I wasn't very good at it, but I managed to keep up with the other instrumentalists. I had other situations happen in that school, one of which, when I first entered the band, we had a teacher. When I entered the band, we had a very pretty young woman who was a conductor. She was a teacher in the school. She taught music and other things. Her name was Miss Sunshine, which is she was a very pretty woman and a teacher, and she conducted the band. At one time, I saw her later on, maybe the following year, she was walking in the hallway and she was stopped by another student. I've forgotten his name now, but just as well, but he stopped her to talk, and she was standing near the wall, so he put one arm on one side of her, one arm on the other side of her, and he bent over to kiss her. And she let out a scream. I was standing nearby, and a door opened, and one of the teachers, Mr. Sklar, whom I adored, he was a wonderful guy, and he just, one punch, he knocked the guy out. He just punched him, and the next day I heard he was sent to a reform school. This Mr. Sklar went into, became a very important part of my life. He was a gym teacher, he was an ex-Army captain, and the war was over at that point, and he went back to teaching, and he was a single man and Jewish man, and my mother asked for me to invite him for Shabbat dinner, which I did, and he agreed to come to, and it was wonderful. He asked me at that time to write a biography of my life, so he was going to use it. He was going for a degree. Well, I don't know which degree, but it was a degree certainly having to do with his teaching. And I wrote whatever I could come up with. I don't know if it helped him or not, but I did do that for him. Now, PS-12 was a very strange school. Maybe it was similar to other ones, but it was very different than a yeshiva. First of all, it was mixed. There were probably mostly Jewish, Italian, a few Irish, and a few Hispanics, and a few black kids in it. And we all seemed to get along okay, except the most egregious group of people were the Italian boys, who a lot of them were very close to becoming criminal in their actions. They had I forgot his name, but he was the head of a small gang, and they stopped me for protection money. They wanted a quarter from me to protect them for the month, every month, from other people hitting me, and I refused to pay it, so they beat me up. There were a few other incidents in that school that were, oh yeah, I found out, by the way, that same group used to go to New Jersey they had pistols, and they would practice target shooting. So I knew they were for real, they were not anybody to be messed with. There was another Italian fellow in my class. His name was Patsy Armetta. I won't forget, but you know, in those days when you leave the class, everybody would line up, and when the bell rang, you marched out in single file to your next class. And he was always pushing and shoving me. And there's one time I just pushed back. So he decided that was an affront to his reputation. So he said, okay, I'll meet you down at the park after school at 3 o'clock, and we'll fight it out. And I was kind of scared because I never had that kind of situation happen before. I only had one friend in the entire class, a guy. His name was Saul Fries. I'll talk about him later on. But he went down with me, and we fought around a little bit. We wrestled, and nobody won anything. You know, I wasn't hurt, he wasn't hurt, but he learned to respect me because I did fight back. I didn't just knuckle under. My father was an ardent Zionist, and he wanted me to feel the same way. During the course of my earlier life, he did take me he got me involved in things Jewish, and he used to take me to the theater, Yiddish theater, not musicals, but serious drama on Second Avenue.
David Adler?
No, I saw...
You're a little too young for that, huh?
Yeah.
Do you remember any of the actors?
Yes, I can't remember his name now, but...
Who was the guy who was in Love and Death? My grandfather owned a piece of land. He always carried it with him. Spiel?
Schooler?
Maybe.
No. That was a guy, and he was on that guy was a broadcaster on WEVD, Tzvi Schooler. I'm trying, the famous actor, I just can't remember his name now.
Is it the guy who was in Tevye?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, we'll look that up on Google.
Yeah.
Keep going.
At any rate, prior to that, he also took me during the war years, he took me to hear lectures where survivors who managed to escape came and told the story of what happened to the Jews in Europe. And I remember going home traumatized at the horror of it, and I couldn't sleep at night, and all I kept dreaming is catching some Nazi and tying him up to a chair and torturing him until he died. It hit me very badly. My mother's entire family was killed, and my mother had a half-sister who escaped and came to the U.S. with her husband. At that point, when my father took me later on, he took me to meet some Israeli shlichim, they're called in Hebrew, which means they represent their emissaries, so to speak, who came to New York to build up a Zionist movement because the state of Israel was declared in 1947 when I was 13 years old, and which was a very, very proud moment in my life. I was very happy about that, and I went to camp, and the name of the camp was Ein Harod, which is named after a kibbutz in Israel of the same name. And I met a lot of people there, including a couple of guys who are still my friends, Ted Freilich and Chaim Krukowski. I also met my future wife-to-be, Sonia. She was in a lower grade because she was 2 years younger. She was in a lower tier at the camp, as were both Chaim and Tuvia.
And how old were you?
I was when I went to camp there, I was 14, and I had a job there. They gave us, I was one of the older groups, they gave me the job of taking care of the horse. We had a horse named King. We called him Melech, or King. And my job was every day was to get him and put a harness on him. He was out in the field, and I'd walk up to him and put a harness on him and walk him to the wagon, hook him up to the wagon that we had, and I had to drive the garbage down to the garbage dump. The pails of garbage, people loaded on there, and I drove it down there and dumped it, brought the horse back, and let him go out to pasture again. That was a daily job I had, and it didn't take very long. It took an hour a day, maybe, and it was fine. I had a lot of fun with that. In Ein Harod, we had all kinds of wonderful activities. I learned a lot of Hebrew dances, Hebrew singing. I was in the choir, and I still remember a lot of them. And I met I liked my wife to be Sonia, but she was a bit on the young side for me, meaning she was 12 and I was 14. She didn't have the womanly charm, which means breasts, I suppose, to a young boy. So I had other girls. I had other girls that I had fun dancing with, and doing whatever we did as a group. The following year, I had entered. At age 15, I entered Stuyvesant High School. I had passed the test for it.
At 15?
At 15, yeah, I was only there for 3 years because I was in the 9th grade at age 14. So 15, 16, and 17, I graduated high school when I was 17. So the last 3 years of high school were, I started at that point, at age 15. Or it was the fall, perhaps it was 14 and a half, and because I was 15 in March. So it was probably at age 14 and a half I entered high school. And it was, Stuyvesant High School at that time was on 15th Street, between 15th and 16th, on First Avenue, or near First Avenue. I had a lot of great teachers. I did very well in science and math and shop and English. Certain things had me stymied. I wasn't very good in Spanish, which I took as the language of choice to learn. And I made a couple of friends there, none that went past my being in Stuyvesant. But while I was there, I had a couple of friends. And I had a lot of interesting, I needed to get my hands on some money because I wanted to buy things. And I wanted a bicycle in particular. So my mother says, get a job and you'll earn some money and you'll buy a bike, which I did. I got a job with a doctor's office, with a laboratory that had me going to doctors' offices, picking up samples for them to test and sending the results back to the doctor. So I'd pick those up, bring it back to the lab, and after a while, that job got a little boring, so I got a job in a sweater factory. And the sweater factory, they're not sweaters, I'm sorry, scarves. They made woolen scarves. So they were inexpensive scarves. They came on big rolls and they cut them down to size. And I bought some from the manufacturer there, my employer, and I sold them in Stuyvesant. If I bought them for a quarter, I sold them for 35 cents or something like that. So I made some profit on it, and I was able to sustain my wants for candy or whatever else. But that wasn't enough because that didn't last. I also ended up, my aunt and uncle had a shop on Clinton Street where they sold neckties and ties and neckties. And I'd buy them, take a box of them from them, and I'd bring it into school and I'd sell them to the teachers or to the students, whoever wanted them. And that continued when I went to college, at the very beginning of college. And
you did well in chemistry?
Yeah, I did very well in chemistry, very well in physics, exceedingly well in mathematics, very well in English.
And what did you do with your knowledge of chemistry?
Okay, well, my Aunt Anna, who is probably my favorite aunt because she spent so much time with me. She was a teenager when I was born, and she was going to work. She was a new arrival. She graduated high school, and she was going to work, and she'd come to my house and buy me toys. Well, by the age of 13, she wanted to know what I wanted to do, what I wanted as a present. So I said, yeah, I'd like a chemistry set. So she bought me one of these Gilbert chemistry sets, and there were simple little experiments and whatever. But when I got to Stuyvesant High School, I met a fellow there who was involved in making, shall we say, pyrodynamics, and that was anything that burns or explodes. And he'd make little firecrackers or more lethal stuff, and I learned about how to make them. So at that time, you were able to go on 4th Avenue below 14th Street. There were a bunch of stores selling wholesale chemicals. So I'd go in there, buy a pound of phosphorus and a pound of potassium chlorate. I went to a drugstore and I bought these empty gel pills, the same gelatin pills that we take, but they were openable, they were blank, there was nothing in them. And I used to fill one side with potassium chlorate and the other side with phosphorus. And when you shake it and throw it on the ground, it blows up like a firecracker, not much worse than a firecracker. So I decided I was going to sell those in school, made a business out of it, but I had to carry them around with me, and I was afraid of them exploding in my pocket. So what I did is I opened every capsule, or when I was making them, in between the two chemicals, I put a little piece of cotton in, the soft cotton, and closed it again and put it in a Band-Aid tin can, and I carried those around, and I used to sell them for whatever I could get, whatever the going price was, and I made some money that way. And I made money when at recess. We were at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, no, actually around 12 o'clock, everybody was getting hungry, and we were trying to figure out who's going to go down to the local restaurant. It wasn't really a restaurant, it was a takeout place. It was Italian food, they had pizzas and sandwiches. And we ended up calling it Tomaine Joe's, because I think some of the kids got sick from the food. But I used to make a profit. I'd run down 4 flights of steps, after them bring back an order for the various students, and I'd make some money on that score. I had a couple of other illegal things that I did to make some money. I manufactured, or I supplied slugs for the subways, pornographic literature, et cetera, all to make some money to have things to buy, so I could buy things.
Hey, at this time, were you kosher in the house?
Oh, yes.
And your father always ate kosher?
Always.
But you know.
Yes, I did.
Well,
As a
how
matter,
do you eat in the pizza place?
well, pizza's, pizza, and that's all I ordered. It was just bread and cheese.
But so you were kosher
Yeah.
24/7.
Right. Now, after I joined the movement, and sometimes we used to go out for lunch. So I went out with a bunch of girls. I used to like to go out with the girls because they always had money to pay. And we would put our money together and just order some food. So I had one memory I remember very distinctly. Your mother was part of that group. My wife, Sonia, was part of that group. She was not my girlfriend, but she was just another girl. And I think 3 or 4 other girls were there, and myself. And the girls always had the money to pay. I'd have a few cents here and there. But I never ate Chinese food until that time. And they said, oh, you got to try this mustard. It's delicious. It's like deli mustard. And deli mustard, as you know, is not very strong. So I took a fork. Luckily, it wasn't a spoon. And I picked up a fork full of mustard, and I put it in my mouth. And my head nearly exploded with the pain. And the girls thought it was the best joke to pull on me. I was yelling and screaming, stuffing things into my mouth to dull the pain.
So how old were you?
I was, at that point, I was 14, maybe going on 15.
Okay, how old were you on your last year in Echarad?
My last year in Echarad, I was 16.
And were you, after that, were you going out with Mom?
Actually, not quite yet. I think we went, perhaps when I was 16 years old, going on 17. She was going out with another guy who I knew, whose name was Eitan Levine, who later became a rabbi. But be that as it may, I stole her away from him.
And when was that?
And that was when I was 17 years old.
Okay, now she was living in East New York and you were living in
Kew Garden Hills.
So she's what we would call geographically undesirable.
Yes, but I used to, at age 17 or 18 already, I was able to borrow my father's car.
So at 17 you would drive to East New York?
No, actually I took the train. I took the train, and there was a train that went to Sutphen Boulevard in Jamaica. Then I'd get on the L there, and the L went to, she lived in oh my goodness, I forgot. East New York. She lived in East New York, and the train stopped about 5 blocks away from my house. I'd walk down there, and we'd go out and do something, and then I'd go home.
Where did the train stop in Kew Gardens?
The last stop on Jamaica Avenue. It was an L, the L train. They've since torn that down. There is no more L there. But that was the last stop. It was Sutphen Boulevard and Jamaica Avenue.
Technically at 17 and when Mom was 15, you really started dating.
Yeah, I started dating.
Okay. And you were going steady? Or?
At that point, yes.
Oh, okay.
At that point, yes. The geography was a little difficult. When I became 18, I got a license. Then I used to borrow my father's car sometimes to go see her.
You were picking her up at 16 in a car. That must have been quite the achievement for her.
Yeah, her parents liked me. I was a nice Jewish boy, and I was interested in doing things and, getting educated.
Now, was Sophie already in a wheelchair when you met her?
No, she was not.
Okay.
Sophie being my mother-in-law, my to-be mother-in-law. No, she was not sitting in a wheelchair, but she was a Czech woman, and her father, Mortimer, he was actually born in Chicago, and he had another brother, and when his father died, the mother took the kids back to home to Czechoslovakia. That would prove to be what saved Sonia and the whole family from being killed by the Germans during the war, because they were able to get out. They were American citizens at birth. Even if they, got married, if they were born in a foreign country, they were citizens.
Okay, and your soon-to-be father-in-law Mortimer was a florist, correct?
No, he sold various things that related to the floral industry, not flowers themselves, but pins and all kinds of other gadgets that you need. He wasn't very successful, but got back. He was an older man already when he came back to New York. He was originally he was born in Chicago, but the family settled in New York, and they had 4 kids to raise. Sonia's oldest sister was the oldest in the family. Then came her brother Harry. Then Tuvia, who went directly from Czechoslovakia to Israel. He was in the British Army in Israel fighting against the Germans and against the Italians, of course, the Nazis. And then Sonia was the youngest in the family.
Let me just jump in here. And Tuvia was decorated for driving a truck that was about to explode over a ravine or over a cliff.
Yeah, it was loaded with explosives and was rolled down the hill by, I think, some Germans, or I don't know who the soldiers were, trying to attack the Americans, and he jumped into the vehicle and drove it to the edge of a small cliff and jumped out in time, and the car exploded down below.
Okay, so now it's 18. You're at NYU, right?
No, not quite.
Not quite.
Not quite. I graduated at 17.
Okay.
I wasn't going to go to college. I had no interest in. When I graduated from school, there was no mention of, it was just my name, but no mention of any university I was going to, because I was a Zionist, and I wanted to go live on a kibbutz, and I was going to learn about farming, and I went up to, we had a farm that the Zionist youth movement I belonged to was Hechalutz Hatzair, which means the young pioneers. And I had an affinity for cows. I liked them as animals, and I became a raftan in Hebrew, which means somebody who takes care of the refet, which is the barn that houses the cows.
Wait a second. So you were there for how long?
I was there for almost a year.
Oh, okay.
I was there I didn't even go to my own graduation. I just packed my stuff, hitchhiked up to Poughkeepsie, the Burbank is where it was, and I started working in the barn. I had to learn how to milk cows by hand, just in case we lost power. But I used to milk about 18 cows a day.
And how many chickens did you kill a day?
Well, that was enough. I hated the chickens. They're in a separate coop. They were egg-laying chickens. And, nobody. We used to segregate the chickens who didn't lay eggs anymore and keep them for eating, meaning our eating. And it became my job to kill them. And I remember one incident. I was wearing good pants, and I took out an axe. I had an axe, and I put the chicken on the stump, and I chopped the head off, and blood spurted out all over, ruined my pants. So I figured there's got to be a better way. So I found an old camp trunk, in one of the rooms of the house, and I came up with my own form of killing the chicken. It was a guillotine. I used to pick up the chicken, bring her over to flip open the trunk, put her body in, hold her head out, and slam the trunk, and that beheaded the chicken, and it was thrashing around inside, and all the blood stayed inside, and I didn't get bloodied up anymore. So that was, you know, and then I went, of course, I didn't do much of that. That wasn't my big job. My big job was working with the cows, and I enjoyed that. We used to wrestle with them. Younger heifers, they were rambunctious. We'd try to do it as they do in a rodeo to get them down to the ground. So we'd wrestle. Most of the time, we did not succeed. Everybody had a place had a place in the farm about what work they had to do. There were a couple of chicken guys, a couple of cow guys, a couple of girls in the kitchen, and then there was a tractor. Which the guy was. We'd take out go help other farmers to raise some money for ourselves. We'd go to work.
When did you leave the farm?
I left in, I believe it was February of. Following February, so I was there really from June through February.
And why'd you leave?
Because it was other people were leaving. They didn't want the job anymore. They didn't want to be there anymore. It was very difficult work, and it was freezing cold. And one winter, I remember I got frostbite in one ear. It was 26 below zero, and I had walked with a friend of mine to town to buy a chocolate bar and Pepsi. Coming back, my right ear swelled up, and I was lucky not to have needed amputation, but I fell asleep, and it was difficult sleeping because every time I rolled over on that ear, I'd wake up because it was painful as hell.
So what'd you do when you got back? You went back to...
I went back, I didn't, I had a friend who was, younger brother was in the movement. He was an Israeli. And his older brother, who became a friend of mine, his name was Yaakov Ben Dror. He had a business. He was a mechanical engineer. He had a business building machinery for the bookbinding industry. And he said, look, you ought to go you're good in math, you're good in science. Why don't you go into engineering? So I said, that sounds like a good idea. So I had taken the test for City College, and I passed it. But I was already going out with Sonia, and she was going to a school up in the Bronx. It was it was connected with Hunter College, and I wanted to be with her as much as I could. So I went to engineering school in the Bronx as well. NYU had a school up there, and I started school there. My parents were able to pay my tuition, and.
So the reason you went to NYU was to be near Mom?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And I met her. It was not quite walking distance, but I used to meet her after school, and we'd ride down in subway together. We'd stop off and get something to eat. And then she might have had to go home, and I had to go to my home, or sometimes we both went together to Brooklyn. So it was
Brooklyn?
Because that's where she lived.
I thought she lived in East New York.
That East New York is Brooklyn.
Okay.
You don't know your New York geography, David. Yeah, East New York is, anyhow, it's right connected to Brownsville, which is also in New York. But in either case, we wanted to get married badly. We were going together already a couple of years, and our parents.
Well, what year did you start NYU? How old were you?
I was 18, so it was in 52.
Okay, and so shortly thereafter you wanted to get married.
Yeah, well, even before that, let me tell you a little bit about NYU. I joined the reason you couldn't get another reason I went to NYU is because they had an ROTC there, which is a Reserve Officers Training Corps. It was Army or an Air Force. So I joined the Air Force, ROTC. That was more interesting to me. And that kept you from getting drafted into the Korean War until you became an officer, if you finished 4 years in the ROTC, you were obliged to go serve in the Air Force or Army. And I remember taking a test for at one point in my second or third year, and actually, no, it was my second year for pilot aptitude training, and I came in first in a class of 80 in pilot aptitude. So they really wanted to make an officer out of me. When my wife-to-be and my mother heard that, they put their foot down, and they said, "No way, Jose, you're not going to be a pilot." I mean, the Korean War was mostly over. This was 1952. So so I quit. I quit the ROTC, and by the time 1955 rolled around, we were getting married. I did not want my parents to pay for school, so I transferred to City College.
Okay, wait a second. So you had how many years at NYU?
2.
2, and then you got married at 21?
Yes.
And then when you got married, you transferred to City College?
Yes. I got married in June, and I started City College in September. No, I went to summer school
Well, hey, you didn't need to go to NYU anymore because your wife was right with you.
That's right. Well,
by the way, just as an aside, thank you. I'm very happy I did not grow up as an army rat or a farm boy.
Okay, in either case, my wife-to-be took secretarial. She dropped out of college altogether because if I was going to go to school, somebody had to earn some money after we got married. But we'll get to that later on when we talk about the marriage. When I was 14 years old, the State of Israel was declared, and I felt a sense of elation, unbelievably so. I was walking on Clinton Street, and all the radios were out on the sidewalk playing all kinds of Hebrew music, including Hatikva. And I remember I felt such a sense of pride. It was such a wonderful feeling. At that time, I joined Hechalutza Tzair, which is the Young Pioneers. It's a left-of-center movement. And they wanted American Jewish young people to move to Israel and help in the struggle. And they helped to build the country up. What we did is the organization rented a sound truck, and we parked it on the corner of Delancey and Essex Street. And it's a very busy corner in Manhattan and Lower East Side where I lived. We'd spread out a flag on the ground, and we would dance horrors for everybody, other Israeli dances, and people would throw money on the flag, and we managed to collect quite a bit of money. That was just one of the things. Of course, running around with pushkas, with collection cans in the subways, asking for handouts for Israel, for donations to Israel. And I remember many times I got kicked off the subways by the conductors, but I waited for the next train. And when it happened too often, I'd pull out my water gun, and as the train was pulling away from the station, the conductors were standing between the two cars on a platform, making sure the doors were closed, and when it started moving, I ran alongside him, squirting him with a water gun. He couldn't stop me because he was moving and the train was moving, but that was just a little prank. But I found a lot of new friends in this youth movement, and some of them have remained friends with me for the rest, as of today. And that's where I met Ted Freilich, and I met Chaim Krukowski and others.
I thought you met them at camp.
The camp was I went to their summer camp that they had up in the Youngsville, New York, which is near Liberty, New York, which is near Monticello.
Wait, what camp was that?
It was Camp En Harod.
Oh, okay. So you met them in New York, and then you saw them again at camp?
Yeah, the whole people, everybody who belonged.
And you met Mom in New York?
Yeah,
And then you all went to the same camp?
yeah, that's right.
Oh, I didn't know that.
As a matter of fact, Mom was there a year before I was. She, she was her brother Tuvia, who lived in Daganya Bet, was in New York, and he introduced her to the Hechelot Tzayir, and she joined
And
there.
he introduced her even though he was in Israel?
He knew about it, yeah, and
So he wrote her.
he came here, and he went with her up to the camp, and she was just 12 years old, or maybe only 11 actually, because she was there a year before me, and she's 2 years younger than me, so you can figure it's 11 years old when she went there the first time. And I knew who she was, but I wasn't really interested because she was too young for me. I was 14 and she was 11. I was looking for somebody closer to me.
12.
I was looking at her and looking around for girls who were closer to my age at that time. And it was marvelous. It was awe-inspiring. We learned all kinds of Israeli dances. I was in the choir. That we sang Hebrew songs, and to raise money for Israel, we made the appointments were made in various hotels, most of whom were Jewish hotels in the Borscht circuit, and we went there and performed song and dance for them, for money, of course.
Let me stop you for a second. So when did you teach Pete Seeger Tzena Tzena?
During that period of time, we had the house in Borough Park. It was. That's where the house was, on 50th Street in Borough Park. And one time we were told that Pete Seeger was coming. He wanted to learn some Israeli songs. And indeed, he did come. He lived in Manhattan, as did I. And we sang songs for him. One of them was Tzena Tzena. And he liked that song, but he asked on the way home he gave me a lift back to Manhattan in his car. He asked me to come over to his house to help him with the words and to explain what this song is all about. And then later on, the Weavers came out with the song Tzena Tzena.
It was a hit.
It was a hit. And I taught it to him. But speaking about Pete Seeger, just one thing, he seemed like a nice guy, and he was a terrific banjo player. I hung around listening in his house. After we were done with our session, I'd hang around listening to him teach the other people how to play the instrument. One thing that I didn't like about him, he was an unabashed communist. He was pro-Russia, pro-Soviet, and that annoyed me because even though we were slightly to the left, we were not pro-Russia. At least most of us were not. Up in camp, we learned all kinds of songs and dances. I learned how to do all the Israeli dances, and Sonia in particular was a wonderful dancer. Even though she was only 11, but still.
She was probably 12, if you were 14.
Oh, you're right. You're right. She was probably 12. She was going out with some other guy in the camp who was in my bunk, coincidentally. At that point, I was looking for other girls, and I had a girlfriend. My job in the camp was kind of interesting because I brought a couple of rabbits with me. I had a friend, Bernard Rosen, Bunim we called him, that was his Hebrew name. And we built a little place for them to stay. And unfortunately, every morning we'd get up out of bed and we'd see the white rabbit jumping around all over, and we had to go and run and catch him. And then, of course, we were always late to breakfast or lunch or whatever it was. And they decided not to, after a while, after we did that too much, they decided to punish us by not letting us in for the meal. And we were hungry, so I used to sneak into the bottom of the house there, and that's where they stored all the vegetables, and we used to grab a cantaloupe or two, and that was our meal for the day, at least for lunch. That's why I love cantaloupe so much. It reminds me of the camp. We also did all kinds of other little pranks, like raids on the girls' bunks, and all the things that kids do in camp. But it was a wonderful experience. And the following year, when I went to camp, they gave me a job. They had a horse there and a wagon, and they said, look, we'll give you a job to do. You can take the garbage down. You got to catch the horse who's out in the pasture somewheres, bridle him and then attach him to the wagon and pick up the garbage and drive it down to the garbage dump. So it was a lot of fun for me because I felt like a Westerner. I was messing around with a horse and a wagon, and I would do that. That was my job, and I enjoyed it. And we had other things that we used to do that, like raids on the girls' bunks. Another thing, I was into chemistry a bit at that time at age 14, and I brought some chemicals down there to do different things, some of it not so nice. I brought hydrochloric acid, and I had other chemicals I put into it, and it emitted hydrogen sulfide, which if you breathe too much of it, it can be poisonous, but one of the kids went in, he sniffed it, in the bunk we were raiding, and he ended up throwing up all over the place. But I had to stop doing that because they got angry at me at camp for doing that. Other than that, we had very interesting episodes. In the middle of the night, we'd get up, and for an organized trip. We went and we built up a tower. We had wood, and we had to be done at night because it symbolized what the Israelis were doing, or the Palestinians, and then the Israelis before Israel was a country. In order to erect a structure, once you did that and you were starting a kibbutz, you put up a structure according to Turkish law, which still applied then, even though the Brits they controlled Israel, what was Israel, before it became a state. There was a law, not once a house has a roof on it, you can't knock it down. Nobody can knock it down. That was old Turkish law. So that was just and then we played all kinds of other games, us versus the Arabs, us versus the British, and we divided the groups up to different. Nobody got hurt. It was not but we had to sneak by them and do something, you know. On one of the trips, that was a year later, I happened to look more eagerly at the girl named Sonia Bondi, and she was. We were traveling to one of the hotels to perform, and it was so crowded she had to sit on my lap, and she was bouncing up and down, and as we were all singing together, and I instantly fell in love with her. And when I showed signs of being interested, she also went along with the feeling the same about me, and she got rid of her other boyfriend, and we were together as a boyfriend and girlfriend. So that was the best thing I could have done, because later she became my wife. And
so what year was this?
This was a year later. I was 15.
Okay, and she was 13.
13, right.
So you were dating each other from 13 on.
Yes.
You got married.
Yes. In 1957, or maybe it was 58, we moved to Brooklyn, Sonia and I, because the building we were living in was condemned it was going to be knocked down for a bigger building. And we found an apartment in Brooklyn on Pennsylvania Avenue. And we moved there into a two-family house. We had the upper floor, and I was working as an engineer, and Sonia was working as a secretary.
Tell us a little about your engineer.
Yeah. Well, I was working as an engineer, I have a degree in civil engineering, and I was working in construction. And when I was working on first I worked on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, and I worked on an offshoot on one of the other highways that connected to there, that went through that same area. I had worked on the LIE, as well as across the Clearview.
People think you're out on the road, so you went to an office, right?
I went to an office.
And what did you do all day?
We did calculations of different materials we used and what we had to do, and design certain things to help us do our job better. But I was on a new construction site in Brooklyn, and I was in the office. We had an office there at the location. They rented a house, an empty house, and that's where our office was. And I was out working, watching what the guys were doing, the contractor was doing, and making comments to the workers there about how they should do, what they should do in what different way. And that was a nice job. I enjoyed it very much. Of course, during lunchtime, we all played cards, poker probably, and it was most of the card playing. But about a year later, in 1959, in March of 1959, my son David was born.
Hey, before you get to the best part, tell us about your boss at the engineering company.
No, that was in the prior, when I worked for the city, not the state.
Okay,
So
before you were an engineer for the state, you were an engineer for the city, correct?
Yeah, I worked at the Transit Authority in Brooklyn.
And what did you do there?
Well, I was doing some design work, doing mostly drafting, and we had a small group of 3 or 4 guys working under one boss, who was used to sit in his chair all day long, never moved out of it, and he sat there either chewing on or smoking a cigar. To me, it was so disheartening because there was no input from him. I didn't learn much from him. I remember one time I ran out of work to do, so he said, come here, come with me. And I walked with him in the center of the room. There was a big bunch of, I guess, shelves that were covered up, and he opened one of the doors to it, and he pulled out a drawing, and it was originally designed probably during the Depression in the 1930s, but it was never acted on. It was never built. So he took the drawing out, and he said, redraw this entire print. So I did. It took me probably 10 to 12 days of doing it correctly. And when I was done with that, he took the older one, and he ripped it up. And I said, why did I do this job? He said, well, I thought we'd just refresh the file. So I realized that job was not for me. There was no incentive to work there anymore. It was boring. So I had already passed the test for the New York State Department of Public Works, and I took a job with them, and that's what got me to the highway in 1959.
If you liked it so much,
Highway
why
work.
did you leave it? You liked working for the state.
Yeah, it was much more interesting because I was out in construction doing positive things, building stuff, building this highway, and that ran all the way, from the main highway to the city streets. And even that job was kind of boring. But what I did at one point, I decided, I always had a business flair for some reason, going back to my high school days, where I would always wheel and deal and buy stuff and resell it and so on and so forth. I decided that I was going to write a book. And I started the book while I was still working for the city, but I finished it. When I was living in Brooklyn, and I remember it was called, the title of the book was Norton's Essential Guide on Passing the Civil Service Exams for the City of New York. And I had it. I got a mimeograph machine and a typewriter, and Sonia typed it all up on stencils, and I printed sheets, and then we collated them. The collation system was very funny because we'd have page 1, 2, 3, and 4, and maybe let's say up to 8, and we had some friends over, Tuvia Freilich and his wife, Ted and Hannah Freilich, came over for dinner, and I forced them into collating my book. We spread out page 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in stacks, and we went around picking up one page of each until we got the 70 or 80 pages in the book, and then we fed them. And I had it cleaned up. I put it together, and I sold the book at the Civil Service Bookshop. And I didn't make much money on it, but it was a lot of fun doing it.
How many years did you get royalty checks from that? Must have been 20 years.
No, it wasn't.
Well, it was still, it was when I was conscious, you'd say that you still got checks.
Maybe I did, yes. But they weren't very big, you know. I'd get 60% of the sale price of the book, and the guy who had the store, whose store it was, got the other 40%. So, but couldn't make a living on that, doing that kind of stuff. It was just, you know, small amounts.
So when did you quit being an engineer for the state? And
well,
what did you do?
I enjoyed working for the state in construction. We worked on the LIE, and then we went to work on a bridge, putting up a bridge for a railroad on the board of Queens in Long Island. And I realized I was going to be in this rut, and it was a rut. I wanted to do something on my own, but I didn't know what. And I spoke to Sonia's brother, who had a business manufacturing machines for the printing industry. They were located in Long Island, and he introduced me to the man who was selling his product, who was promoting it and selling it. It was an elderly gentleman, probably in his mid to late 60s, who had an office on 34th Street opposite the Penn Station. And the whole company was me and him and a secretary. This guy was had been a very successful businessman, and he came from very poor background, but he made it up and he became a millionaire. He sold his company, and after retiring for 6 months, he couldn't take it anymore, so he knew he wanted to be in business, so he started up a business on 34th Street, and it was just an office basically.
So wait, so he didn't leave Lawson? He started a business after he left Lawson?
Yes, he sold the business to a much bigger company. Lawson manufactured paper cutters, these big, massive paper cutters. And they sold it to another company, the company called Mealy Goss Dexter. They had all the kinds of binding machines, folding machines and cutting machines and drilling machines.
Sold what company to Mealy?
His own company.
It was called
the company was called David Shulkin Company, and I was working for him. And he sold machinery of different.
Okay, wait, stop. Shulkin's working for Lawson.
He sold his business. Not working, he owned it.
He owned Loss.
Yeah, he and partners, one little at a time, he bought them out.
Okay, so he sold Lawson to Mealy.
Mealy, right.
And then he went nuts, retired, so he opened up David Shulkin
Company.
on 34th Street, and they sold drill bits mostly.
No, and any machines that I could sell. Is it being,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, the machines I sold were round corner cutters, cutting machines, drilling machines, the paper drills for drilling them, stitching machines, all kinds of, not on the massive super production kind of machines, but they were on smaller quantity machines. Where you could, if you had 1,000 books to do, you could do it with the equipment I was selling.
You joined his company in '61, right?
Yeah, I worked for him for 2 years.
Yeah, but, okay, so now we're going back to 1959. You're still working for the state for another 2 years.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I started working for David Shulkin in 1961, and it was a big learning experience. I learned how to write a good business letter. He didn't know much about technical stuff, even though he was in the machinery business. He knew very little, but I knew more than he did about that, and I used to have frequent arguments with him about how the machines worked. One day he said to me, "If you think you're so damn smart, why don't you buy the business from me?" I just had nothing to add to that comment, but I just thought about it, and I said, "Please tell me about it. What would you like? How could we do something like that?" So he said, "Well, I'm going to ask you for a price. You can pay me for it, and you can have the business, including the furniture and whatever." And it was a small 2-room office, just 3 people working there, me and him and a secretary. So I remember I didn't have 2 dimes to rub together because all of this time I had side jobs while I was working for the city and the state. I was fixing people's homes. I was building bookcases for them, building tables, and all kinds of other stuff. So I went to my father, and I asked him. The amount he told me that he wanted was $25,000, which seemed to me like an enormous amount in those days. I didn't have maybe $100 or $200 in my bank account, so I needed money for it. So
That'd be like $400,000 today.
maybe, I don't know, whatever the numbers are. But I borrowed. I needed $25,000, so I borrowed half from my father and half from my uncle Dan, who was my father's brother-in-law.
Wait a second. I thought you paid less for it. I thought you paid $15,000 for it.
No,
No,
it was 25. Yeah,
$25,000.
$25,000.
So you didn't negotiate with him.
No. But he was very happy. He said, "I'll let you keep the name, the David Shulkin Company, for a year, and then after that you have to change the name." Because he said, "I don't want my name dragged through the mud just in case you do things that are not reputable." So I said, "Okay." But on the better side of it, he came in every single day, or most days of the week, to help me on his own time, and he didn't want any money for it. He said, "I want to see you succeed." And I remember the salary I had my last salary check from him, I was earning $6,500 a year. That's it. So I had to do jobs on the side to add to that amount because I couldn't live on $6,500 a year.
That's like $70,000-$80,000 a year.
Whatever. I don't know about the comparison, what it is today. But I remember reading somewhere that the Internal Revenue said that most companies fail during their first year. And I remember after the year was over, my accountant told me that the company made $30 or $35,000 that year, and that's what I had after all expenses. So I jumped from 6,500 to 30,000, which is quite a jump. And I remember coming home and telling my wife, "Honey, we made it," because that was, that was a lot of money. Getting back to 1959, we decided Sonia had a baby boy whose name we called David. I remember very distinctly how joyous it was to become a father. And
what were you doing while Mom was in labor?
Well, I was playing around with after I brought her to the hospital, I didn't know how long I'd have to be there. So my uncle lived nearby, and I went to his house. I walked over to his house, and I told him about Sonia being in the hospital, and it's going to be a while before she gives birth. So I asked him to come along with me. I wanted to show him my new hi-fi equipment that I bought. I did that. It was not far away, and I showed him that equipment, took him home, and then went back to the hospital, where I was informed that we had a baby boy. I was very thrilled about it, and I went to see Sonia, and she was doing very well. And I remember it was a Friday night, and I remember walking out in the street. I was kind of elated with joy of being a father, and I saw a cop walking towards me. So I said, "Hey, officer, I just became a father." And he stopped. He says, "Yeah, who's your pediatrician? Who are you going to use?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "If you want, I'll give you the name of my pediatrician." He gave me his phone number, but and to call him to get the information about the pediatrician. But I found somebody else that Sonia wanted, another doctor, and we used him. And it was I remember going to work the day after 2 days after he was born, and I brought cigars for all the guys on the site, a whole box of cigars, and I was handing out cigars. That was a lot of fun. Of course, my part in those days, women were not breastfeeding particularly. It was all purchased formulas, and I would put it together. Because I told Sonia, let me do the mixing and everything. I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, I can do it exactly. And I made the milk, and I had to put in certain other stuff in it, whatever. And that's how it was for the period of time that she got the hang of it. And it was great. The only part I didn't like is having to get up in the middle of the night when he was crying and wanted something. So I told Sonia, "Look, on weekends I'll do anything you want, anytime, but I can't do it in the middle of the week because I got to be at work at 8 in the morning. That means I got to be up at 7 or earlier to get there." So we agreed that weekends were my job and midweek was her job. After a number of years, we moved from there to Forest Hills.
What year was that?
Maybe 1962 or 63.
So while you were working for Shulkin, you moved to Forest Hills?
Yes.
Okay, and then while you were in Forest Hills, you bought the company from him?
Yes.
Okay, 99-34 67th Road.
In Forest Hills, right. While we lived in Brooklyn, one evening we had a visit from Ted Freilich and his wife Ann, and she just signed up to go to law school, and I was kind of intrigued a little bit about it because I thought maybe I wasn't happy with my job, and I thought I'd like to go into something else. So it took me all of about 5 minutes, and I was lost to the idea. I had the idea to go to law school. And next day I went down and signed up for law school at New York Law. And I was at night school because I still had to keep working during the day. You
went there for 2 years?
I was there for 2 years. I thought I'd go into patent law. Well, one day in my second year, I went up to the library and I looked at patents and how they were written. And I thought to myself, if I have to do this for the rest of my life, I'd commit suicide. It was so damn boring. So I dropped out of it. A little later on, we moved to Forest Hills. In Forest Hills, my father and a partner owned a building on 67th Road, and there was an apartment available with
On the sixth
two.
floor?
No, it was actually in the beginning. It was on the 5th floor. It was a smaller apartment. Later, we moved up to the 6th floor. At that time, Saul was born, and we needed the extra bedroom anyway. So,
What was your Zeta's partner's name?
his name was Margolis.
And you didn't particularly care for him, did you?
No, he was a sleazy kind of guy. He was always looking for angles how to cheat my father out of his half of the. My father was a house painter, and his excess money he invested with Margolis to buy buildings. They owned about 5 or 6 buildings in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens, and this was one of them. This is the nicest building they had, and we moved in there. While in there, I started pulling pranks in the building. Some of them were hilariously funny. Like one evening, Moshe Caspi, my sister Rhoda's husband, and I decided to put into action one of the ideas I had. Outside the elevator door, on the wall opposite the window of the elevator, there was a number telling you what floor you were on. So we decided to switch them all around. We put number 6 on number 3, number 3 on number 4, number 4 on number 1, on number 2, and so on. So when people got in the elevator, they knew how to go to the 5th floor. They went and they looked out the window, and it was only the 2nd floor. They said, "What's going on?" And this kept happening. It didn't do any harm to anybody, but we thought it was hilarious. Of course, the super knew immediately who did it, because he said, "Who's tall enough to be able to put those signs up change those numbers on the wall?" It had to be Norton.
And what was the super's name? Charlie?
Charlie. Yeah, his name was Charlie. He was an obnoxious individual. While I was living in that building, there was a spare room in the back in the basement, and I decided to make that a workshop for myself, woodworking shop.
Would you be surprised to know that it's still a workshop now?
I don't know if it is.
It is.
How do you know?
Because I went there
And you
last week.
Are you serious? And you walked in and what's in it?
I don't know, it was locked. But
Oh.
let's go back. So Rhoda and Moshe moved in on the 1st floor, correct?
Was it first or
I
second?
thought it was the
Maybe the first.
And Grandpa, Mom's dad, moved into a basement apartment.
Yeah, it wasn't a real apartment. It was just a big room, one big room, and I guess it was used as a storage room. But he needed, after his wife died, Sonia's mother that passed away.
Well, wait a second. I never met Savta, but I went to Grandpa's house in Brooklyn, and all I remember was it was rather messy, and there were tons of cats.
Oh, really? I don't remember the cats, but it wasn't a very nice place to live.
Well, do you remember the cat you bought?
I didn't buy it. Somebody gave it to me.
Okay. The cat's name?
Chati,
Okay.
short for chatul, which means cat in Hebrew.
And when I became allergic, or we found out I was allergic to cats, you drove it to Grandpa's house and gave it to him.
I don't remember that at all.
Okay. So anyway, did you play any tricks on Margolis?
Oh yeah, lots of them, as much as we could. The best one I did is, Margolis had a wife and no children, never had any children, and his wife made him put his shoes outside the door when he had to walk into the house in his socks, with only his socks on. So I'd go down every once in a while and take one shoe, the right shoe, toss it in the incinerator, and then another time I would take the left shoe once he got another pair of shoes. Nobody knew who did it. they didn't suspect me. In order to erase my tracks, when I moved out of the building eventually, my sister Evelyn got my apartment. So I told her, do me a favor, for a few times, go down and throw one of his shoes in the incinerator so they can't blame me. They would never think it was me, and they wouldn't know who it was at this point. And she did that. It was very funny. I had some altercations with Charlie. He was really obnoxious. One time the circuit failed somewhere in the basement, and he blamed me for hooking up using my electrical tools, and indeed it was not the reason. But, and Moshe had a fist fight with him and knocked over a can of paint, and they were all full of paint, both of them. He was a bad guy, Charlie. He was not a nice person.
How was parking in the neighborhood?
It was tough. I remember one particular incident. Well, there was a parking lot in a building on the same street on the corner, but they charged a fair amount of money for it, so I didn't want to use it, so I always try to park in the street. One day we were coming home, Sonia and I and the family were coming home from the beach, and I saw a spot right across the street from where the entrance of our building was. So I zipped in there, zipped up to it, and I started to back in, and some guy came down the block, and he just beat me to it. He just raced in there. I said, hey, you saw me backing up. What are you doing? He says, he shut up, he rolled up his window and shut the engine off, and he wouldn't come out. I said, I'm going to get you. So there were a bunch of old people sitting on the sidewalk right next to where the car was, and they all yelled at him. He was here first. Get out. And he wouldn't get out. So eventually, Sonia didn't want me to start and get into a fight, so she went upstairs with the kids. I went to my basement, and I put some stuff together. And after a while, he was not there, and he left the car, and he went to wherever he was going. So I approached the old people sitting on the outside on chairs, and I said, do me a favor, one of you look up the block and another one down the block to see if he's coming back or if there are any police coming around. And I did is I took a pound of sugar and I dumped it into his gas tank. And then I took a paint and varnish remover and I put it up on top of on the roof of the car, and it was bubbling. The paint was becoming erased on the car. And as the last step, I blew out all 4 of his tires. So he was there for several days, could never move his car. He finally had to have it towed. But there were other adventures there. But when I started working in the wood shop, I enjoyed it very much. I had a saw and a couple of other tools, electric saw. And I'd build bookcases, and I had done that even when we lived on the east side. I got some planks of wood and I built a bookcase. I still have it in the basement. This is like 70 years later, or 80 years, no, it's about 70 years later, and I still have the bookcase. It's still standing. But I used to do odd jobs in some of the apartment buildings. People needed a shelf put in somewhere, or they needed something to fix a closet or to do some minor repairs, and I would do that to add a little money to my wages.
And what was the name of your company?
Well, I was getting tired of working at the state.
No. Wasn't it Dason Products?
No.
You had envelopes printed up with Dason Products as the return address.
I don't remember that at all.
Okay. I assume it was David's son.
No, it wasn't.
Products.
I don't know what it was.
Also, you told us about the time you cut your finger, but tell us about how you got into scuba diving.
Well, while I was living in Forest Hills, I always loved the water, and I would snorkel, had a little pair of goggles, and whenever we went up to Lake Peekskill, where my parents had a house, a summer house, or lakes anywhere, or the ocean for that matter, I'd put my goggles on and look at the fish and whatever else I could find underwater. So I decided I watched enough of, what was the name of that Frenchman who was? Jacques Cousteau. I was mesmerized by the movies he made, the films, and all the diving he did. So I decided I wanted to take a course in it. And at one of the Ys in Manhattan, they were giving a course. I signed up for it, and I passed the course, and I got certified. So after that, whenever we went on vacation, if it was anywhere near the ocean, I would get a tank and I'd go diving.
But long before that, you dove in New York.
Yeah, I know I did. I dove in the area of Rockaway. There was a beach that was unmanned. It was not a swimming beach.
But because lifeguards would not let you scuba dive.
You couldn't scuba dive on a lifeguard on the lifeguard's watch. So we went to a beach. I went to a beach, and I met another fellow who lived right near me. He was also a diver, and I'd go diving down there. I got a spear gun, and I speared fish, and I brought them home for Mom. She didn't really like cleaning them, so I let that go for a while. I quit bringing fish home.
And we went there often as a family. You remember the nickname we used for that beach?
No.
Cesspool Alley?
Cesspool. Oh, well, there was rubbish on the beach. I mean, for that reason, it wasn't a cesspool at all. It was the same water as next door down the beach. You know. But, and we went out.
Snorkeling there.
Yeah.
About 5 years ago.
Oh, yeah?
Didn't see a thing.
Yeah, that's the problem with the beaches in the north.
But back then, I remembered seeing crayfish, crabs.
Yeah.
On, that pile of rocks. We always had horseshoe crabs washing on the shore. It was my nursery school and the family synagogue. We were out here on Yiska service. They kicked all the kids out onto the street. But I knew, because it was my nursery school, they had a playground here. And I figured if I could fit my head in through here, which I couldn't do now, that I could get in. So when the parents came out from Yiska service, they saw all the kids playing in the playground on either Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. This was my pizza place. And Friday nights, Dad and I, after Mom went to sleep, would watch The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and order a pizza at 10 o'clock. And this used to be associated, our grocery store. I can't tell you how many times I walked down here with my mom. This was our family dentist, Dr. Ryman, who was perhaps the worst Jewish dentist on God's green earth. But they were across the street from our building. And here was my backyard. Still looks pretty big. There was a dilapidated building here, a shack that my mother said never go in there, but I did anyway. And this is where I heard the Beatles live for the first time. I stood at that fence and heard them all the way from Forest Hill Stadium.
After a while of being at 325 West 34th Street, which was a two-room office, I realized that I need to have a bigger place to probably bring some machinery in there to sell, bookbinding machines. And so I found this place at 480 Canal, which is on the corner of Hudson and Canal, a ground floor space, and I rented it. And I was able to move some machinery in that I represented so people can come in and see what it was before they bought it. That lasted several years. And one day my accountant told me about a program that the city was developing because a lot of companies were moving out of New York at that time. That was probably around 1968, 69, etc. So what I did was I applied. I had to put a $5,000 check in with the application. It's non-refundable. So I put in that $5,000 check, which was a lot of money in those days, and they turned me down. So after talking to my attorney, my accountants, they said, give up on it, you can't fight City Hall. So I said, I'm going to fight City Hall. And I went home, and I sat down on a weekend, and I wrote a letter. I explained to the board that was making the decision that even though we are a small company, we have a big impact on the graphic arts industry, the printing industry in New York, because we were bringing people, one of the things we did is we helped people get into business in New York. For instance, there might be a guy who's a foreman in a bindery, and he wanted to go into his own business but didn't have a lot of money, so he came to me at one point when he needed machinery, and I would get him the machines, used machines most of the time, and he'd give me a down payment, and he'd pay out the balance in notes, monthly notes.
And then what happened?
And
Letter.
excuse me?
What happened after you wrote the letter?
They realized, I told them I brought a company in from New Jersey into New York, and I had people who were out of work, who had lost a bindery because they couldn't renew the lease and where they were. I said, here's a space for you. It was right across the street from my office on Hudson Street, 200 Hudson Street. And I put them in business, and the employees from that New Jersey place, most of them lived in New York anyway, so I got them all jobs there. So with that one stroke, they understood what the impact was, and that I do have an influence. And I told them I finance people into going to business. So I got the right to look around, and I drove around in Queens, mostly in Queens because it was more spacious, with my attorney, and we found a building on Norton Boulevard and 45th Street.
Okay, but let's go back. So you moved to 417 Canal after you went to 480 Canal.
Oh, yes.
And how did you park there?
Oh, yeah, well, in 417, we had the landlord didn't want to renew our lease. He had somebody who could pay more money. So I managed to get an apartment at 417 Canal Street, which is about a block and a half away from where I was then. It was a much bigger place, and it had lots of storage space. It was a 2-story inside store, and the office was upstairs, and all the machinery was downstairs. I had decided at one point to start getting involved in used machinery, because when Nixon came in, it was in office, I was starting to import machinery from Europe, from Germany, from Italy, et cetera, and France. They devalued the dollar. And over a weekend, I owed somebody $80,000 in Germany, and over the weekend, the number went up to 88,000, because it was at 10,000. No, it was an 8,000. No, how big are you see? Well, whatever it was, I owed him a lot of money, a lot more money. So I really started looking for apartments, for a new place then, because I had to get out of Manhattan. Our business was growing, and it was doing well.
Okay, but how did you park at 417?
Well, the 417 Canal Street is almost impossible to park, but there was a triangle right across the street. I was near the exit of the Holland Tunnel. I saw a place where the police cars parked, so I figured I'd get in there and park, but I took if somebody found out I wasn't a policeman, I'd get a ticket. So we had a cop who was in the area who I befriended. He used to come in for a warm cup of coffee during the winter time. So I said, could you get me in one of these cards that says I'm in the police department that I could put in the windshield, on the window? So he said, yeah, sure. He got me one of those. And for a while, I was able to park there.
Didn't you have it printed?
No, he gave it to me.
He loaned it to you, and you had it printed, I thought.
Copied or printed? Maybe. I don't remember what happened. Maybe he did that. Yes, it's possible.
And then Mary called you at the office one day.
Yeah, and yeah, we had a housekeeper, Mary, who called me one day. And she said the police were calling. They wanted to know if you were in the police department. I said, okay, thanks a lot. And I ran out and I moved my car because I know that's the only reason they're asking. And I got rid of the card, and parking there was still tough as hell. So we decided